Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has spoken by phone with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. The rare call came as Albanese's Labour government considers joining other Western nations in officially recognising a Palestinian state. Albanese is also pursuing a phone call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he says he will advocate for a two-state solution. Over the weekend, an estimated 90,000 Australians, that's the police estimate, of course, organisers estimate as much as 3 or 4 times as much as that number, but marching across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in support of Gaza in what is really the first anti-war protest that we've seen across the bridge. Let's get more with our next guest. Donald Rothwell is a Professor of International Law at Australian National University. Really great to have you with us. So set up for us, there's obviously one set of expectations, as we've seen over the weekend, in terms of the reflection of how a lot of ordinary Australians are feeling about the humanitarian crisis and potentially what, at least symbolically, diplomatically, what Australia's government and leaders can do from here. But what is the process of a recognition of a Palestinian state, and what are the steps involved here?
Well, quite simply, it's a decision that needs to be made by the Albanese government. It's confirmed by the cabinet of the Albanese government, and the Prime Minister's made that clear in recent statements. Once the cabinet has made that decision, well, then a formal announcement can be made. Normally, those types of announcements are made in Canberra, but of course there's something of an expectation that if the Prime Minister is going to make this announcement on behalf of Australia, it may well be made at the coming United Nations General Assembly meetings in September in New York.
I thought it was interesting. We heard from Foreign Minister Penny Wong this morning, and one of the things that she said is that sort of recognition or some action to be taken while there is still a Palestine left to acknowledge, right, as we come up to almost 2 years of this conflict. Is time of the essence here, or is it important to sort of make sure that all of the criteria that not just Australia is considering, but some of the other nations as well, Australian allies, are looking at?
Well, from a legal perspective, I think all of the criteria have been met. But we have seen from the United Kingdom and Canada, for example, a range of additional factors. And indeed, both the Foreign Minister and Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister have been outlining a range of criteria that would need to be met. Perhaps most importantly, the disarmament of Hamas, the release of the remaining hostages, but also reform to the Palestinian Authority. But I think we're also getting a sense, perhaps in the last 24, 48 hours here in Australia, that there's perhaps a growing sense of urgency on the part of the Australian government. The Foreign Minister this morning in other media comments has made the view known that Australia is becoming increasingly concerned that there will be no Palestine left to recognise, and I think that's a recognition of the increasing extent of the military operations of Israel in Gaza, but also, of course, threats on the part of the Israeli Knesset, and perhaps even alluded to by Benjamin Netanyahu, that Israel might be seeking to annex part of the Palestinian territory, whether that's the West Bank or perhaps even the Gaza Strip. So Australia is clearly concerned about those developments that are occurring in Israel and doesn't want to get left behind in terms of recognising formally the existence of a Palestinian state.
And you raised some of the points that I was about to ask. If it is in fact the situation that Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, or at least some of his cabinet are not interested in a two-state solution, there are worries about settlements. What are the options available to countries like Australia and other international players to be able to change that course?
Well, normally the United Nations Security Council would be the obvious forum in which these matters would be discussed, but the Security Council has really been neutralised as a result of the United States veto and its opposition to any clear Security Council action in relation to the conflict in Gaza. So that's why I think we're increasingly seeing Australia join with other like-minded countries, led by other 2 permanent members of the Security Council, France and the United Kingdom, try to move forward on that. But there's a range of initiatives and a range of measures that would need to be taken, including, most importantly, as you're alluding to, placing pressure on Israel to ultimately recognise the existence of a Palestinian state and also legitimise the two-state solution moving forward.
Does the turmoil surrounding the ICC case in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, kind of paint a picture of how, I don't want to say irrelevant, but perhaps how hopeless some of these international institutions are in the face of this scenario?
Well, I wouldn't say that as an international lawyer, obviously, and many of these international court cases, whether it's the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, will take many years to play out. It's really the United Nations Security Council, which is designed to deal rapidly with emerging security situations. But as I've said, the Security Council has really been quite neutralised throughout much of this conflict. So that's why we're possibly looking at alternate means and options in terms of trying to deal with this. And one of the big issues would be is that if there was to be a ceasefire and if there was to be a recognition of an independent Palestinian state, who would provide security for that independent Palestinian state? And there's been some discussion already as to whether or not France or other Middle Eastern states, Gulf states, might be involved in that process. But providing security ongoing for Palestine, of course, that would result in security for Israel, is clearly going to be critical moving forward.
If you take a look at the examples of Afghanistan and Myanmar that you've pointed out, what does a recognition of a state mean in terms of permanence and the sort of inability or, I guess, unwillingness to revoke that?
Well, once a state has been recognised, you can't withdraw that recognition unless that state happens to disintegrate. And there's been examples of that have occurred post-World War II. The former Yugoslavia might be a good example, or, of course, the former USSR. But once a new state is recognised, Australia, for example, or the United Kingdom or France or Canada can't withdraw that recognition because they no longer recognise the existence of that entity as a state. Governments can come and go, and, of course, we've seen that very much in the case of the Taliban in Afghanistan, but ultimately the state remains as a legally recognised entity for the purposes of international law. And that's to be distinguished from whether or not a recognised independent Palestine would gain ultimately membership of the United Nations, which of course currently it doesn't have.
Do you have expectations that all of these criteria, including demilitarization of Hamas, including reform of the Palestinian Authority, including the release of all of the remaining hostages, is likely to happen by the UN General Assembly? And if it doesn't, what does it mean in terms of, I guess, not even be able to make this gesture, as Prime Minister Albanese has referred to it, knowing that Australia wants it to be more than just a gesture?
Well, I think what we can say is that given current events, that timeline seems to be very ambitious, and unless there was some sort of radical change in the circumstances, and critically, Hamas, of course, is key to this in terms of their ability to agree to release the hostages, and we've seen comments from them over the last 72 hours as to why they may not release the hostages until there's a full recognition of an independent Palestinian state, also including references to Jerusalem being the capital of an independent Palestinian state. So those, of course, are very politically contentious issues. So at the moment, we perhaps are reaching an impasse in terms of Hamas not prepared to make any modifications or adjustments or concessions. Likewise, Israel and the United States, at one level, seemingly to step back a little bit from trying to be proactive in terms of bringing about a resolution of this issue. But yet, on the other hand, we've got this other group of collective states seeking to move forward with Palestinian recognition.
Donald, really great to have you with us. Donald Rothwell, who's a Professor of International Law at ANU. We do have more on Australia Ahead every Tuesday at 10:40 a.m. if you're watching here in Sydney, 8:40 a.m. if you're catching us in Hong Kong. You can also tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, delving into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple, Spotify or Bloomberg.com.